was possibly the worst day of Harry's entire life. He, Ron, Fred, and George sat together in the corner of the Gryffindors' common room, unable to say anything to each other. Percy wasn't there. He had gone to send an owl to Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Then he shut himself in his dormitory. No afternoon ever lasted as long as that one had, nor any Gryffindor tower been so crowded yet so quiet. Near sunset, Fred and George went up to bed, unable to sit there any longer. "She knew something, Harry," said Ron, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the wardrobe in the staff room. "That's why she was taken. It wasn't some stupid thing about Percy at all. She'd found out something about the Chamber of Secrets. That must be why she was." Ron rubbed his eyes frantically. "I mean, she was a pureblood. There can't be any other reason." Harry could see the sun sinking blood red below the skyline. This was the worst he had ever felt. If there was only something they could do, anything. "Harry," said Ron, "do you think there's any chance at all that she's not?" Harry didn't know what to say. He couldn't see how Ginny could still be alive. "Do you know what?" said Ron. "I think we should go to see Lockhart. Tell him what we know. He's going to try to get into the chamber. We can tell him where we think it is, and tell him the basilisk is there." Because Harry couldn't think of anything else to do, and because he wanted to be doing something, he agreed. The Gryffindors around them were so miserable, and they felt sorry for the Weasleys, that nobody even tried to stop them as they got up, crossed the room, and left through the portrait hole. Darkness was falling, and they walked into Lockhart's office. There seemed to be a lot of activity going on inside. They could help hearing the scraping and thumping and hurried footsteps. Harry knocked on, and there was a sudden silence from inside. Then the door opened the tiniest crack, and they saw one of Lockhart's eyes peering through. "Oh, Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley," he said, opening the door a bit wider. "I'm rather busy at the moment. If you'd be quick." "Professor, we've got some information for you," said Harry. "We think it'll help you." Well, it's not terribly." The side of Lockhart's face that you could see looked very uncomfortable. "I mean, well, all right." He opened the door, and they entered. His office was almost completely stripped. Two large trunks stood open in the door on the floor. Robes, jade green, lilac, midnight blue, had all been hastily folded into one of them. Books were jumbled untidily into the other. The photographs had been covered. The walls were crammed into one of the desks. "Are you going somewhere?" said Harry. Well, yes," said Lockhart, ripping the life-size poster of him from the back of the door as he spoke, starting to roll it up. "Urgent call. Unavoidable. Got to go." "What about my sister?" said Ron jerkily. "Oh, well, as to that, most unfortunate," said Lockhart, avoiding their eyes, wrenched open the drawer and started emptying his contents into the bag. "No one regrets more than I." "You're the defense of dark arts teacher," said Harry. "You can't go now, not with the dark stuff going on here." "Well, I must say, when I took the job," Lockhart murmured, now piling on tops and robes, "nothing in the job description didn't expect." "Do you mean you're running away?" said Harry disbelievingly. "After all the stuff you did in all your books?" "Books can be misleading," said Lockhart delicately. "You wrote them!" Harry shouted. "Oh, my dear boy," said Lockhart, straightening up, frowning at Harry. "Do you use your common sense? My books wouldn't have sold half as well if people didn't think I'd done all those things. No one really wants to read about an ugly old Armenian warlock, even if he did save a village from werewolves. He did dreadful in front of the cover. No dress sense at all. The witch who banished the abandoned banshee had hairy chins. I mean, come on." "So you've been taking credit for the load of what other people have done?" said Harry incredulously. "Harry," said Lockhart, shaking his head impatiently. "It's not really as simple as that. There was work involved. I had to track these people down, ask them exactly how they managed to do what they did, and then I put a memory charm on them so they wouldn't remember doing it. It's the thing I pride myself on the most, my memory charms. It's been a lot of work, Harry. Not all the book signings and publicity and photos, you know. You want fame. You have to be prepared for a long, hard slog. He banged the lids of the trunk shut and locked them. Well, let's see, he said. Oh, I think that's everything. Yes, only the one thing left. He pulled out his wand and turned to them. Awfully sorry, boys, but I have to put a memory charm on you now. Can't have you blabbling my secrets all over the place. I'd never sell another book. Harry reached for his wand just in time. Lockhart had barely raised his, and Harry said, Expelliarmus! Lockhart blasted backward, falling over his trunk. His wand flew high into the air. Ron caught it and flung it out of the open window. Shouldn't have let Professor Snape teach us that one, said Harry furiously, kicking Lockhart's trunk aside. Lockhart was looking up at him, feeble once more. Harry was still pointing his wand at him. What do you want me to do? Said Lockhart weakly. I don't know where the Chamber of Secrets is. There's nothing I can do. Well, you're in luck, said Harry, forcing Lockhart to his feet. At one point, we think we know where it is and what's inside it. Let's go. They marched Lockhart out of his office, down the nearest stairs, along the dark long corridor, where the messages shone on the wall and the door of Moaning Myrtle's bathroom. They sent Lockhart in first. Harry was pleased to see he was shaking. Moaning Myrtle was sitting there on the tank at the end of the toilet. Oh, it's you, she said when she saw Harry. What do you want this time? To ask you how you died, said Harry. Myrtle's whole aspect changed at once. She looked as though she had never been asked such a flattering question. Ooh, it was dreadful, she said with relish. It happened right in here. I died in this very stall. I remember it so well. I had hidden because Olaf Hornby was teasing me about my glasses, and the door was locked, and I was crying, and then I heard somebody come in. They said something funny, a different language. I think it must have been. Anyway, what really got me was that it was a boy speaking. So I locked the door to tell him to go on, get out of his own toilet, and then, Myrtle swelled up importantly, her face shining, I died. How? Said Harry. No idea, said Myrtle in hushed tones. I just remember seeing the great big pair of big yellow eyes. My whole body sort of seized up, and then I floated away. She looked dreamily at Harry. And then I came back again. I was determined to haunt Olive Hornaby. You see, or she was so sorry after she'd laughed at my glasses. Well, where exactly did you see the eyes? Said Harry. Somewhere over there, said Myrtle, pointing vaguely towards the sink in front of the toilet. Harry and Ron hurried over to Mr. Lockhart was standing back, a look of sort of utter terror on his face. It looked like an ordinary sink. They examined every inch of it, inside and out, including the pipes below, and Harry saw it. Scratched on the side of one of the copper taps was a tiny snake. That tap's never worked, said Myrtle brightly, as she tried to turn it. Harry, said Ron, say something in Parseltongue. But Harry thought hard. The only times he'd ever managed to speak Parseltongue was when he'd been face to face with the snake. So he stared hard at the tiny engraving, trying to imagine it was real. Open up, he said. Ron looked at him and shook his head. English, he said. Harry looked at the snake, willing himself to believe it was alive. If he moved his head in the candlelight, making it look as though it were moving. Open up. Except the words that he heard were a strange hissing that escaped from him, and at once the tap glowed with brilliant white light and began to spin. Next second, the sink began to move. The sink, in fact, sank right out of sight, leaving a large pipe exposed, a pipe wide enough for a man to slide into. Harry heard Ron gasp and look again. He must have made up his mind what he was going to do. I'm going down there, he said. He could not go, not now that they had found the entrance to the chamber, not if he was ever going to the faintest, slimiest, wildest chance of getting Ginny out alive. Me too, said Ron. There was a pause. Well, you hardly seem to need me, said Lockhart, with a shadow of his old smile. I'll just... He put his hand to the door, but Ron and Harry both pointed their wands at him. You can go first, Ron snarled, white-faced and wandless. Lockhart approached the opening. Boys, he said in a feeble voice. Boys, what good will I do? Harry jabbed him in the back with his wand, and Lockhart slid his legs down into the pipe. I really don't think, he started to say, but Ron gave him a push, and he slid out of sight. Harry followed quickly. He lowered himself into the pipe and let go. He was rushing down the endless, slimy, dark slide. He could see more pipes branching off into all directions, none of them as large as theirs, which twisted and turned, sloping steeply downward, and he knew he was feeling deeper and deeper below the school, and even dangerous. Behind him he could hear Ron thudding slightly at the curves. Then, just as he begun to worry about what would happen, they hit the ground and the pipe leveled out, and he shot out at the end of the wet thud, landing on the very damp floor of a dark stone tunnel large enough to stand in. Lockhart was getting to his feet, a little ways away, covered in slime, a white as a ghost. Harry stood there beside Ron and came whizzing out of the pipe too. "It must be miles under the school," said Harry, his voice echoing the black tunnel. "Under the lake, probably," said Ron, squinting around the dark, slimy walls. All three of them turned to stare in the darkness ahead. "Luminous," Harry murmured as his wand lit again. "Come on," he said to Ron and Lockhart, and off they went, their footsteps slapping loudly on the wet floor. The tunnel was so dark they could hardly see where the distance ahead. The shadows on the wet walls looked monstrous in the wan light. "Remember," said Harry quietly as they walked cautiously forward, "any sign of movement, close your eyes right away." But the tunnel was quiet as the grave. At the first unexpected round they heard a loud crunch. Ron stepped on what turned out to be a rat skull. Harry lowered his wand and took out at the floor. Hard to imagine what Ginny might look like if they found her. Harry had led forward around the dock at the end of the tunnel. "Harry, there's something up there," said Ron hoarsely, grabbing Harry's shoulder. They froze, watching Harry just see the outline of something huge, curved, lying across the tunnel. It was moving. "Maybe it's asleep," he breathed, glancing back to the other two. Lockhart's hands pressed over his eyes. Harry turned back to look at the thing, his heart beating as fast as it, and it hurt. Very slowly, his eyes narrowed. He could see them and make still. Harry edged forward as he held the wand high. The light slid over a gigantic snakeskin of a vivid, poisonous green, lying curled in an empty across the tunnel floor. This creature that had shed it must be 20 feet long at least. "Blimey," said Ron weakly. There was a sudden movement behind them. Gilderoy Lockhart's knees had given way. "Get up," said Ron sharply, pointing his wand at Lockhart. Lockhart got to his feet and then dived at Ron, knocking him to the ground. Harry jumped forward a bit too late, and Lockhart was straightened up, pointing Ron's wand at his hand, and was gleaming, smiling at his face. "The adventure ends here, boys. I shall now take a bit of my skin back up to the school and tell them that I was too late to save the girl, and that you two tragically lost your minds at the sight of her mangled body. Say goodbye to your memories." He raised Ron's spello-taped wand over his head and yelled, "Obliviate!" And the wand exploded with the force of a small bomb. Harry flung his arms over his head and ran, slipping over the coils of the snakeskin out of the way, and great chunks of the tunnel ceiling were now thundering to the floor. Next moment he was standing alone, gazing at the solid wall, half-broken rock. "Ron!" he shouted. "Are you okay, Ron?" "I'm here," came Ron's muffled voice from behind the rock. "I'm okay. This Git's not, though. He got blasted by my wand." There was a dead thud, a loud "ow!" and suddenly came through. Ron had just kicked Lockhart's shins. "What now?" Ron's voice said, sounding desperate. "We can't get through. It'll take ages." Harry looked up at the tunnel ceiling. Huge cracks had appeared in it. He had never tried to break apart anything so large with rocks and magic. Now he didn't seem a good moment to try. What if the tunnel caved in? Oh, there was another thud and another ow from behind the rocks. They were wasting time. Ginny had already been in the Chamber of Secrets for hours. Harry knew he was the only one thing to do. Wait there, he called to Ron. Wait, with Lockhart. I'll go on. If I'm not back in an hour. There was a very pregnant pause. I'll try to shift some of these rocks, said Ron, seemed to be trying to keep his voice steady, so you can get back through. And Harry, see you in a bit, said Harry, trying to inject some confidence into his shaking voice, and he set off alone, past the giant snakeskin. Soon, distant noise of Ron straining to shift the rocks was gone. The tunnel turned and turned again. Every nerve in Harry's body was tingling unpleasantly. He wanted the tunnel to end. He had dreaded what he'd find when it did. And then at last he crept around another corner bend and he saw a solid wall ahead, which two entwined serpents in the carved. Their eyes were set, great glinting emeralds. Harry approached his throat very dry. There was no need to pretend their stone snakes were real. Their eyes looked strangely alive. He could guess what he had to do, so he cleared his throat and said, Open, said Harry in a low, faint hiss. The serpents parted, the wall cracked open, halves smoothly out of light, and Harry, shaking from his head to foot, walked inside.